Hello everybody, my name is Shandy and welcome back to the channel. If you are wondering why content's been a bit dry, it's because I've been busy. Simple as that. But I'm back now. It's a new year, and with New Year's come New Year's resolutions. Mine is to have a bigger focus on this whole YouTube thing. And I figured the best way to start that out would be by covering an opinion piece on James Gunn. Specifically, this individual's attempt at breaking down why they feel people are saying James Gunn writes women poorly. James Gunn is a bit of an interesting creative for me, as he is partially responsible for creating two of the greatest Marvel films in its near 20-year catalogue, both of which feature two of the best written and realized female characters in the MCU, capable of standing toe-to-toe with any of their male counterparts, as well as some of the better portrayed female characters, at least when you don't include the Netflix shows or Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Yet he is also partially responsible for creating some rather large dudders, as well as promoting one of the worst superhero films I have ever seen, but I assume it's a little more complicated than that. James Gunn seems to be a bit of a mixed bag at his absolute worst. However, considering that even his worst properties still possess incredibly impactful moments with some stellar characters, I think it would be rather difficult to argue that his weakness lies in how he depicts his female characters. But stranger things have happened, and I think the only thing that matters when it comes down to discussions like this are the references. Is this person able to argue their case using scenes from the films they are critiquing, and are they able to do it accurately? Despite my personal enjoyment of these films, I am not against the idea of critiquing them if the references are accurate and the arguments are sound. And I know this doesn't need to be said, but I shall be doing it anyway. Don't bother this person. This video is not meant to be a mean-spirited jab at them, nor is it meant to act as a gateway to their personal harassment. If you don't have anything constructive to add to the conversation, then do us all a favor and stay out of it. That being said, petty insults may or may not be thrown out because I am still an entertainer of sorts and aim to make funny ha-ha content for you all to enjoy. Now with that said, let's see what's in store for us. So Maeve is responding to an individual asking for a legitimate explanation for why it is believed that James Gunn writes women badly, in the form of a Twitter thread. They aim to approach this argument in good faith, which is nice enough to see. So even if I end up disagreeing with them, it's safe to assume this wasn't done maliciously. A rather pleasant deviation from the usual online discourse around the new DC director. They also preface this thread by saying it won't be looking at his non-comic book films such as Scooby-Doo or Slither, as they have not seen those films in a while, preferring to stick to the comic book films. And while I do understand this issue, it does make me sad since both Scooby-Doo 1 and 2 have some pretty great character writing for Velma and Daphne, based on what I remember, even if the films themselves aren't great. But oh well. Maeve states that while some of these issues may seem minor, they do contribute to a larger pattern of issues that people have with Gunn's writing, a sort of death by a thousand cuts situation. I am not one to fault someone for going after nitpicks. A problem is a problem, no matter how big or how small it is. And if smaller problems keep piling up, I do agree that it will cause harm to the overall quality of a product, similar to if you purchased iron panels for a new fence, but every second or third sheet came with a handful of scratches. You'd be less impressed with the fence as a whole based on these smaller issues. For the rest of the thread, I will be having my lovely assistant Uverful, who some of you may recognize from older videos as the squid man who yells at things, narrating Maeve's tweets to hopefully provide some much needed personality to the conversation rather than just my bland retelling of these tweets. It also means I don't have to write as much for the script.
We'll start with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 and its depiction of Gamora. Gamora is said to be a dangerous assassin, the deadly daughter of Thanos, yet she spends the movie needing to be saved by men, Peter ×2, Drax ×1. Gunn avoids ever showing her handling a situation.
Interesting start to the convo, but there's something we need to change here. Gamora is the adopted daughter of the Mad Titan, Thanos. Thanos, who at this point is quite comfortably established as a villain known across the galaxy, with the sole ambition of killing a good chunk of the universe. Gamora was genetically modified and trained as a living weapon, alongside her sister, Nebula, and as we will come to find out, Gamora and Nebula were regularly forced to battle against each other by Thanos in an attempt to make them stronger, so not exactly the most loving family. Gamora early on in her story is established to come from an abusive home, where each passing day was met with some new horror to endure. Yet despite that, we are told she overcame those trials to become, as Thanos himself put it in Avengers Infinity War, the most dangerous woman in the galaxy. When we meet her in the first Guardians film, she is attempting to flee this life using the money she would receive from the Collector after delivering him the Power Stone. Yet despite having a pretty strong background, strong motivations, and a very demanding personality, the issue that is being taken is that she is rescued by men and that James Gunn never shows her handling a situation by herself. Okay, well, let's look at the instances where she is rescued, why don't we? The first one would likely be Peter saving her from Drax, who sees Gamora as an extension of Ronan, the man responsible for killing his wife and daughter. During Drax's introduction to the film, he accuses Gamora of being family of Ronan, and that her death would be compensation for his loss. In response to this, Gamora disarms both of the assailants, takes their weapons, and holds Drax at knife point, very clearly showcasing she can kill him where he stands. She didn't do this when she was captured initially, she didn't do this when she was accused of committing terrible deeds across the galaxy. This was only done to deny any familial connections to Ronan and to Thanos. She then disarms herself in an attempt to make peace with Drax, claiming that he needs her help to stop Thanos. Now, I know I usually only ever go to casinos once my luck reaches at least 8 points, but if I were a betting squirrel, I'd say this scene shows Gamora is quite capable of handling situations by herself. The reason Peter saves her is because Drax rushes her after she submits herself and pins her to a wall. Peter witnessed Gamora saving herself initially and only intervenes when there's literally no way she can get herself out of harm's way. While she may have been saved by a man, the man in question appeals to the fact that Gamora betrayed Ronan initially, which would allow Drax a chance at revenge, if he let Gamora live. Gamora is the subject of importance here, not the man. And there's a very good chance that Gamora would have made the same argument if she had the ability to speak, since that's where the conversation was headed towards anyways. Peter was just continuing a point of discussion she was already making in an attempt to get Drax to release her. The second instance where Peter saves her would be when he gives her his helmet in the void of space after Nebula blows up Gamora's ship. Now, for some context in case some of you may not remember what happens in this scene, Gamora and the crew are on Nowhere trying to sell the Power Stone to the Collector. Although, after discovering how powerful the gem actually was, they eventually decided that it's a better decision to give the orb to the Nova Corps. However, as this is happening, Ronan and his forces arrive to capture the orb and kill Gamora, as Drax alerted them to his location after a scuffle he had with Rocket and Groot in a bar. And so, a chase ensues. Gamora, Rocket, and Peter manage to get inside these excavation pods, which are basically near indestructible bumper cars meant to help extract fluids and other valuable minerals from the surrounding area. While these ships manage to maneuver around Nowhere and provide a good bit of challenge to Nebula's forces, eventually Gamora gets overrun and is incapable of making it back to Peter's ship. In a last-ditch attempt to make an escape, she attempts to fly out into open space, which, unbeknownst to her, was possibly the worst thing she could do as these ships were not designed to fly out there, making her easy pickings for Nebula. Rocket states that her body augments will keep her alive for a few more minutes, but due to the fact that their ships weren't designed to be out in open space, they face the risk of meeting the same fate as her. Peter opts against this call and chooses to sacrifice himself in an attempt to save Gamora, by giving her his helmet and calling Yondu for an extraction. Now, what I just explained may sound like just a classic case of saving the damsel in distress, but what is actually going on in this scene? Well, for one thing, Gamora is the one who tries to convince Peter to take the orb to the Nova Corps. She admits it was a mistake to think the Collector could contain the orb, and when Peter tries to take the orb to someone who will pay them a lot of money and won't get them arrested, she responds by saying,
"You're despicable, dishonorable, faithless."
The situation they are currently facing has Gamora needing to make a choice. Does she forsake the lives of countless men, women, and children across the galaxy for the sake of riches, or does she make the self-sacrifice and hand in the orb to the only people who can defend it? Not only does she immediately jump to the more noble choice, she is also the only person to do it. Rocket is scared and wants to flee, and Peter wants to get rich. Groot, he just Groots, he vibes. And Drax is, well, a space autist who tries to kill himself a few times. Gamora during this conflict makes a series of logical and reasonable choices based on the information that she has access to, and showcases a moral backbone that is so stern, it changes Peter's character to be more noble as a result. She is also willing to potentially sacrifice herself in an attempt to get the stone away from Ronan, trying to appeal to Nebula's sensibilities and sense of self-preservation. But sadly, that doesn't work. In both of the situations where she needs to be rescued, she is attempting to appeal to reason, to some sense of understanding in her opponents. Now, you could view this as naive, that these choices are potentially irresponsible and could potentially lead to more trouble than if she was just behaving more selfishly. But that's not who she is, or at least not who she wants to be. Gamora as a character is someone who is trying to be a better person, and through repeated exposure to her friends and eventual family, learns to be such. She learns to keep the very thing that was missing from her life during her years under Thanos. Now, I don't know which instance you are referring to when she is saved by Drax. The only ones I can think of is when Rocket threatens to blow up Yondu's ship with the Age Rod Enforcer, which is wielded by Drax, and then when he blows up Nebula after she insults Gamora repeatedly. And in both situations, not only is Gamora perfectly fine, but she is fully capable of handling the situation she finds herself in. She bounces off Peter's suggestion to invade Ronan's ship with Yondu, and she is fully capable of beating Nebula in a fight as she has done so many times before. So I don't know how either of these count.
There's also a dialogue choice in this film that's frankly bizarre. The movie explicitly states that everything Drax says he means in the most literal sense, so why, after a whole movie of witnessing Gamora reject men's advances, does he call her a green whore? It's a throwaway joke that breaks established character writing to call the female lead a whore. This comes after Rocket blatantly suggests that Gamora prostitutes herself.
Now, this point's a bit bricked because I can't remember where or even if Rocket makes this comment towards Gamora. I skimmed through the later half of the film and stayed on scenes featuring the two in the same room to see if he said it, and I couldn't find this comment. If this is a comment that gets made, then please let me know where. But let's say for argument's sake that this was said. Well, is this something that is out of line for Rocket to say?
This vermin speaks of affairs he knows nothing about. That is true. He has no respect. That is also true.
No, I don't think it is. Rocket is a very insecure person. He hides behind a facade of sarcasm and false bravado to prevent others from getting closer to him, something that gets further explored in the second film. He is deathly afraid of personal connection and will often say things he doesn't mean to people in an attempt to keep them at arm's length. He also really doesn't like it when you degrade him and treat him like some sort of thing. I'm not saying he would be justified for telling Gamora to whore herself out. I'm just saying it would be in character, and depending on when it was said, could carry very different meaning. Editor Shandy's note. I was skimming through the prison scene for some clips and found the comment. Gamora asks Rocket how he plans to get the battery needed for the prison escape, and Rocket says,
To get into that watchtower, I definitely need it.
How are we supposed to do that?
Well, supposedly these bald bodies find you attractive, so maybe you can work out some sort of trade.
You must be joking.
No, I really heard they find you attractive.
Now, while this is clearly an adult-centric joke, let the record show that he does not explicitly state she needs to whore herself out, only that the other prisoners find her attractive and that she could make some sort of trade. Maeve is making this seem like a blatant comment rather than a joke line for the parents watching this film. There is also pre-established content showing that Gamora is more than capable of throwing on the charm in order to get what she wants before double-crossing someone, and Rocket saw this. His entire demeanor in the scene is one which can be summed up in this sentence.
I got one plan, and that plan requires a frickin' Quarnix battery, so figure it out! Can I get back to it?
I don't think this is a fair enough comment to make against James Gunn's writing. Back to recording, Shandy. And for Drax. Oh boy, where do I begin with Drax? I've already mentioned this before, but Drax is basically a space autist. He takes things so literally that he thinks he can catch a metaphor before it goes over his head, because his reflexes are too quick. He is blunt and he says what is on his mind often, but that doesn't necessarily mean he understands how degrading or crude what he is saying actually is, which causes him to get in trouble with many members of the Guardians.
I want you all to know that I am grateful for your acceptance after my blunders. It is pleasing to once again have friends. You! Man who was laying with the Rashkavarian!
Just one time, man.
You, Quill, are my friend.
Thanks.
I recognize this animal. We'd roast him over a flame pit as children. The flesh is quite delicious.
Not helping!
Now let's put more of this liquid into our bodies.
That's the first thing you said that wasn't batshit crazy!
This dumb tree, he is my friend. Spare me your foul gaze, woman.
Why is this one here?
And this green whore, she too.
Oh, you must stop!
This vermin speaks of affairs he knows nothing about! Nobody talks to my friends like that.
And considering that Drax refers to Gamora as a green whore in the same scene where he is glad she is his friend and shoots Nebula in the mouth with a rocket launcher after she degrades Gamora, it's like, can we really say he meant what he said in the same way you and I understand it to be? Like, look at his face after Gamora gets annoyed. He seems quite confused, like he doesn't understand he did something wrong. For all I know, Drax was just shooting the shit with his buddy. It doesn't help that Drax is one of the funniest parts of the first two films, as well as the actual funniest part about Infinity War. If you are genuinely getting offended by this, I don't know, just grow up, I guess? Seriously, I mean that with 100% sincerity. If this is a line that you think is out of character, bad writing, or whatever other stupid buzzword you want to use to justify the idea that James Gunn is somehow writing women horribly, grow up.
We then get to Guardians Volume 2, where there's a marked improvement for Gamora and Nebula. While it's true that their relationship is done well and written compelling, it does not negate the writing of Mantis.
Well, at least you're able to acknowledge that Gamora and Nebula are written well. But there's a problem with this. Your entire outline of issues is that you think Gunn writes women horribly, but now you claim they are compelling and their relationship is well done. And this isn't meant to say that a director and a writer is incapable of improving their work over time or that isn't encouraged. It's just that you haven't suggested that Gunn has ups and downs with his writing, just that it's flat out bad, but whatever. Now the issue to be taken is with Mantis, so before we continue these escapades, let's give a quick summary of who Mantis is. Mantis is the biological daughter of Ego as well as the half-sister of Peter Quill, the Star-Lord. She was raised by Ego alone on his planet for her entire life. Her glorious purpose was to ease Ego's pain and help him sleep. She is an empath, meaning she has the ability to sense other people's emotions while being able to embody them or change them. This allows her to feel things like Drax's joy, Peter's sense of longing, as well as his but it also allows her to experience other people's pain and sadness, and because of that we have one of the best moments from Drax in the entirety of this franchise, but I'll get to that later. Because Mantis' only form of connection was Ego, she was unable to form any sort of attachment with others. Since any time a child was brought to Ego's planet by Yondu, they were swiftly killed in Ego's attempt to unify the cosmos. As such, Mantis holds an incredibly dark secret she feels compelled to keep for the sake of her master and father, the only person she has ever known. It's what leads to her initial conflict with Gamora. The Guardians end up being her very first real taste of companionship, of family, who share feelings with her she likely had never experienced before. Mantis quickly forms a bond with Drax during their time together, despite Drax's space autism. This connection with him and the rest of the Guardians is what allows her to break away from her service to Ego and warn the Guardians of Ego's plan. She also manages to play a critical role in Ego's defeat, as her power allowed her to subdue Ego long enough for Groot and Rocket to blow up his core. While her screen time may be short, she's an integral character to the film's story and possesses some of the franchise's best scenes, both in terms of comedy and sincerity. Now, what dishwater opinion do I need to contest with?
I don't think it's fair to even discuss Mantis' sexist writing without acknowledging that there's a high intersection with racism. Specifically, Mantis is written to embody racist tropes about Asian women. She is explicitly called a white man's pet.
While I know pretty much exactly what you are going to say about the sexist writing part, I'll wait for examples to be given before I dig them up like a fresh grave. Instead, let's look at the high intersection with racism. Now, I'm going to ask a pretty silly question. so bear with me. If the main villain of the film, the space fascist who sees all other organic life as beneath him, who wants to essentially store an element of his essence into every planet he visits so that he can add them to his own biomass, is depicted as a racist, why would that be a bad thing from a story standpoint? And I guess the correct term here would be speciesist, since Mantis isn't exactly, human despite being played by an Asian actress. Ego refers to Mantis as a lesser being, as he does with all other life in the universe. He keeps her around as a pet because she serves a purpose. Now, the idea of characters who view themselves with a more grandiose outlook isn't anything new to the MCU. The most famous example would be Loki, who refers to humanity as an ant he did not mean to trample under his boot. Is he now racist because he said that to a black man? Ego is a celestial, a primordial god older than most civilizations. His name is literally Ego. He thinks a little big of himself. It's the entire point of his character, and ultimately where the main conflict leads. One of the film's biggest thematic points is the idea that you don't have to be important to be special, that you can be just like everyone else, but you're still capable of forming attachments, of finding love and connection, that despite the things that haunt us, there will still be people who care for us if we let them in. Ego's biggest flaw was that he was incapable of setting aside his own sense of superiority in an attempt to form connection with others. He managed to find a woman that he loved wholeheartedly. He had a son he would bond with. Even the twisted companionship he had with Mantis meant he still had someone to help him sleep. But it wasn't enough, and in the end he was entirely alone. And unlike Aquaman, he was not the strongest when he was alone. Also, I'm going to be pedantic, Ego is not a white man. He is a space brain who took on the form of a white man because it was appealing to the sensibilities of the people he visited. He likely took on other forms while traveling the universe, since we see him being able to change his form at will. I also want to talk about the part where you say Mantis embodies racist tropes about Asian women. What would those be exactly? I read a little further down the thread and you don't really mention or touch up on any of those. I'd like to make counters or discuss arguments using information from the films or even the comics, but you don't bring any up. It won't help if I look at other sources for more information on this topic because they aren't your arguments. Not like the other information I've received is helpful or even correct, but an attempt would have been appreciated.
She's subservient, she's unattractive to the male cast, she acts like a child.
She is subservient because she is a literal servant. She is unattractive to Drax, who, as we have already established, is a space autist, and only thinks of his wife with fondness and sadness throughout the entire film. Groot is a tree, Rocket isn't there, and Peter is currently trying to Gamora. Maybe Yondu could have taken a crack at her, but something tells me that would not have been a great idea. She acts like a child because she has had no other social interaction besides with Ego for the vast majority of her life, and her first contact with real people is a bunch of mismanaged buffoons who all act like children themselves on the best of days. She was never going to win this lotto.
People like to use "this is a comic adaptation" as an excuse, and while I'm never going to say that the comics have handled Mantis with dignity, it's important to note that none of these character traits were present in the comics.
And what character traits would those be exactly? I had to look this up to see what changes were made in order to have a more informed opinion on the topic, and man, is there a bit of a change. To spare you some effort, I will simply explain a bit of what I was able to find out. Mantis in the comic was a half Vietnamese, half German human woman raised on Earth by Kree aliens who were hoping to get her to make baby with telepathic space plants known as Kotati. She also looks like this. And while I am incredibly disappointed that this did not translate to live action, I am desperately hoping for her skin to be added to Marvel Rivals. Mantis in the comics is trained in multiple forms of martial arts by the Kree, and this, for some fucking reason, allows Mantis to go toe to feather with the likes of Captain America and Thor? Somehow? Comic books are great, guys. Trust me. But anyways, in the comics, she was a complete badass, capable of taking on furious foes, trained in martial arts, and stood toe-to-toe with the Avengers. And in the movie, she's an actual character with depth, compelling writing, and isn't just a plot device used to birth celestial Jesus. But because she has self-esteem issues, lacks social awareness, and is a literal fucking servant to the guy she witnessed kill all of her brothers and sisters for 2 decades, apparently this means James Gunn is a complete racist/sexist piece of shit because he gave her an arc. Make it make sense? I also read this incredibly awful Mary Sue article on her depiction in Infinity War, and man, can you believe it, I already have an idea for another video.
This is a choice that Gunn has made, and that alone is questionable. Additional context makes Mantis worse. Gunn has sexualized Asian characters before, calling Jubilee as Asian Lolita.
I have found no evidence that this was said. According to Google AI, James Gunn has never made a comment on Jubilee.
And the pictures below are how Mantis, an explicitly Asian character in the source material,
Half Asian.
almost looked. Thankfully, this didn't make it to the movie, but it did make it to screen testing, which means it had Gunn's approval.
According to thedirect.com, Marvel had multiple skin colors in mind for Mantis before Gunn made the change. According to Andy Park, Marvel Studios Director of Visual Development, Mantis almost had green skin, just like she did later in her comic book run, just like how Marvel Rivals depicts her in her old skin choice. Directors use screen tests to determine actors and actresses' performances on camera, specifically how they will look in a scene within the context of the film. Clearly, Gunn was not happy with this portrayal and opted to have it changed to what we got instead. According to the same article, in a now deleted tweet, Gunn wrote that he avoided having Mantis be green because he liked the way she looked in the comics. He liked the way the explicitly half Asian woman looked in the comics, and as such, he avoided having her being depicted as yellow or green. I don't know if the final result is all that accurate, but at least he got the skin tone right.
I'm not going to critique Gunn for how any of the women were portrayed in Infinity War or Endgame, as while he did approve it, he was not the director of these movies.
Oh, thank goodness. Now all I need to do is die reading the Mary Sue's reasoning for why Mantis sucks in that movie. Yippee.
The Suicide Squad did show improvement in the character of Ratcatcher. I don't think it's fair to give Gunn all of the credit for Harley's characterization, as that's built upon Kathy Yan's work in Birds of Prey.
Oh no, I do actually think you should give Gunn quite a bit of credit for Harley in this film. Harley in The Suicide Squad has a bit of agency, such as when she broke herself out of prison, starts developing less evil qualities, and is altogether a lot of fun in this film. In Birds of Prey, Harley is showcased as a few things. She is shown as reliant on Joker for her lavish life, despite being the clown princess of crime. She is dumped by the Joker, and the film has a line explicitly saying that the Joker takes all of the credit for any of Harley's schemes, which happen to have been successful. Despite this, she was incapable of leaving him and threw a massive shit fit at the prospect she was dumped by him. For the first, I'd say 30 minutes, though it actually felt like an hour, she hides herself behind the fake protection she was awarded for being Joker's girl. The tone of the movie is also incredibly off-putting because despite being an awful person responsible for the deaths and potential mutilations of dozens to hundreds to maybe even thousands of people, I'm expected to give a shit and feel an element of sympathy for her because the Joker broke up with her. Because all the people she wronged while being afforded Joker's protection decided they had enough of her shit and wanted her to pay for her crimes towards them. Because she eats peanut butter in a flat above a Chinese restaurant, and unlike Gamora or Nebula or Mantis or even Harley fucking Quinn herself in The Suicide Squad, this version of Harley feels no elements of remorse or regret for her actions towards these people, and only ever targets her energy towards men who are mistreating other women, even though the movie explicitly states that she mistreated other women herself. Point is, if you take issue with Gamora or Mantis for the explicitly stated reasons of being men's property, then by your own standard, you should be taking issue with the fact that Birds of Prey starts off with Harley being another man's property and continues to live under his shadow for the rest of the film. Yet, in The Suicide Squad, not only is she able to forge out an identity for herself in the limited screen time she has, but she also uses men to her advantage rather than the other way around. The best part about this is that there is no meaningful addition Birds of Prey gives Harley to make her a distinct character compared to how she was portrayed in the first Suicide Squad film, besides not being Joker's girl. Yet, most people can clearly tell she has a more positive role in this film, despite it not having any real meaningful connection to Birds of Prey. She's also way fucking hotter.
But it should be noted that Harley spends a chunk of the movie in either tight leather or a dress, and while the Watsonian answer, that is how the character typically dresses, might be given, this is still a conversation on how Gunn treats women in his projects.
By having them dress in outfits that are either A, representative of what they look like in the comics, or in this case the animated TV show she was created in, or B, having them dress in outfits the characters themselves think are pretty and is supplied by the richest man in the country as a gift for their exquisite beauty. Are we also going to talk about the fact that Harley still manages to turn half this man's army upside down in a dress? The last time we saw this was Fiona doing kung fu in the woods. You also have a film like Ready or Not, which recently released, portraying a woman outsmarting and defeating a host of rich predators in their own home while wearing her wedding dress. Why exactly is this such a touchy topic? It looks cool. What's the problem?
Peacemaker truly did make me think that Gunn had evolved past this, that he had grown as a filmmaker and improved his depictions of women. The female characters in that show, as far as season 1, were enjoyable. He didn't fall into racist or misogynist tropes for them.
Cool, so you don't think James Gunn writes comic book women poorly then, right? Especially in the show where Peacemaker literally only wants to use women for their bodies because he's been in prison for a long time? Or does the fact he goes on an arc and learns to be better not really matter because it's a guy this time?
It's unfortunate then that Guardians Volume 3 was such a blatant regression.
Oh boy, now we're cooking with gas.
As said above, I don't hold Gunn responsible for the fridging of Gamora, however he is entirely responsible for how he chose to approach it in his film.
I agree entirely. Despite how unfortunate it was that Gunn's characters were treated the way that they were in Endgame, it does not take away from the fact he chose to write them the way that they are in Guardians of the Galaxy 3. And I am very glad we are talking about Gamora because I do not like her in this movie one bit.
Gamora, previously the driving force of the Guardians being involved in anything, is now described by what was supposed to be her family as a lily pad for Peter Quill to move on from?
You know, I had not quite thought of it like that, but you are kinda correct, actually. Most of the Guardians have not made any sort of comment on the loss of Gamora, and the only time she is mentioned in this film is because of Peter's lovesick puppy side story. According to this Screen Rant article, the events of Guardians of the Galaxy 3 take place in the MCU's modern day, and when accounting for factors like Groot's growth in size and the fact that Nebula says it's been a few years since Gamora's death, suggests that 2 years at least have passed. This is somewhat consistent with Thor Love and Thunder, which shows a few months to a few years passing during Thor's opening montage. Pair that up with the fact that the holiday special indicates a good chunk of time and money was spent on the Guardians buying nowhere, and this timeline sort of matches up, you could say that any sort of memorial ceremony or funeral proceedings were done during these events. But you could also say they weren't. There is no evidence to suggest the Guardians actually properly mourned the loss of one of their closest friends.
Her relationship with her sister is all but ignored, and barring Peter, no one seems to mourn for the original Gamora.
Gamora was the driving force for the team, not just in terms of the plot, but also in forming a less selfish moral system. She cared about the safety of others, and her stubbornness forced the Guardians to change their ways. Rocket focuses less on himself. Peter steers clear of using the orb to get riches. And Drax treats her as a friend despite, and Groot's just a bro. Nebula was her sister, and in Guardians of the Galaxy 2 they started to mend their relationship in quite a stunning scene. Nebula even has a moment of silence for Gamora when Peter finds out she had died. So what the fuck is this movie even trying to do with New Gamora? The simple answer is bad.
The female lead of the series, reducing to something for a man to get over.
Yes, it's actually quite disgusting how little respect is given to old Gamora. I don't disagree.
The new Gamora isn't handled well either. She's the girl boss idea of feminism, not truly engaging as a character and revolving herself around a man.
Where the hell were these bars the first few tweets?
The Gamora of Volume 1 and 2 had a focus on her relationship with her sister, her want to escape her past. This Gamora is a plot device for Quill to yearn over.
And yet you said she spends the entire movie needing to be saved by men, as well as suggesting that James Gunn avoided having her solve her own issues. I don't mind you spitting facts about Volume 3. You go, girl. But let's not pretend like you didn't say some rather cockeyed shit about the first film. I agree with you here. This is correct. It's just this. This is the problem area.
We encounter bizarre, out-of-character dialogue, this time from Nebula, who has had her entire body mutilated, literally torn apart and tortured by the Power Stone. Her sister, violently murdered, says that what Rocket experienced is worse than what Thanos did to her. Volume 2 focused on the abuse that she and Gamora suffered through, and Volume 3 makes an active choice to downplay it.
Volume 3's single-minded focus on Rocket does active damage to prior established content, especially with what Maeve has stated. Nebula's mistreatment by Thanos through her constant battles with Gamora, as well as the fact she had multiple limbs and organs replaced with machinery in an attempt to make her stronger, not only made her a more sympathetic character to follow, but actively put into perspective her actions against Gamora in the previous films. Nebula is a product of suffering, both psychological and physical, actively stunting her own emotional intelligence till she was finally able to best Gamora in combat, allowing her to vent her frustrations of not having a sister during her years of torment, not having someone to look out for her while Thanos treated her more and more as some disposable scrap machinery. There was no need for Gunn to have Nebula say this, to quantify her own suffering through years of torment and neglect, and come to the conclusion it was lesser than that of her friend. While I do think Nebula is probably the best character to relate to Rocket's past, with her sigh of relief that he was alive at the end of the movie being among the more moving moments of the film, there were cleaner ways to incorporate this sort of messaging. More focus could have been put on Nebula's time with Rocket after the Guardians were snapped in Infinity War, showing how they formed a relationship that would warrant a reaction like this, that would allow Nebula to not only sympathize with Rocket's former pain and suffering, but actively put into perspective Rocket's fascination with her. Of course, Rocket would spend time with her as a creature who went through the same torment he did. We've seen small moments that show they care for each other. Rocket builds her a new arm and creates multiple new upgrades for her augments. In the Guardians Holiday Special, Nebula gives Rocket Bucky's arm as a Christmas gift, and while it may be seen as a joke for fans of Infinity War, the moment is treated with sincerity and Rocket is shown to be grateful for the gift. Moments like these do wonders in making me as an audience member care for these characters, not the cringe misery measuring.
Mantis also receives a new personality for this era of the Guardians, first shown in the Christmas special. She's much more confident now, dropping some of the problematic character traits of the past, but we don't get to see how she got from point A to point B.
I agree. Not that her previous traits were problematic, but that we didn't see how she got here. How she developed a more demanding character who is not only confident in herself, but is also willing to chastise other members of the Guardians for being mean to each other. Perhaps the fact she was able to subdue Thanos for as long as she did, paired up with her initial feat against Ego, boosted her self-confidence enough for her to determine her own self-worth was higher than her initial thoughts. Perhaps she saw the void Gamora's absence created in the group and tried through months and years of effort to fill that void as best she could. Maybe she learned to be more sure of herself due to her exposure to Thor, who developed a stronger sense of self-worth despite his failings at the end of Endgame. Maybe all of these factors and more, but the point is, we didn't see it. What we did see was Peter making a pass at Nebula because her eyes are black. Because that was necessary.
Gunn drops the ball on the Guardians of the Galaxy women frequently, and he does it primarily for one reason, to push a male character's story.
There is no one story in these projects. The Guardians of the Galaxy, the Suicide Squad, his TV shows with Peacemaker and Creature Commandos are ensemble stories with a multitude of characters to follow. We may have leading male characters like Rick Flag or Peter Quill to follow for these stories, but it doesn't take away from the contributions of their female companions. It's why these stories, with the exception of Peacemaker, aren't named after the male lead. It's why you refer to Gamora as a titular female lead of the series. It's because you recognize that there's more than one focus in these stories. Guardians of the Galaxy 1 is just as much Gamora's story as it is Peter's, and in some cases even more so. Peter is our entrance into this world. He is the only human character. It makes dissecting things like talking trees or schizo space raccoons easier, because we can always fall back on Peter when things get too silly. Gunn didn't just drop the ball with the female characters in Guardians of the Galaxy 3. he dropped the entire basket of balls. Every character, whether male or female, suffers greatly in that film due to poor management and poor writing. Ask any Adam Warlock fan what their thoughts of him are in this movie, and they will likely be negative. You had problems with Mantis being childish and insecure, but you ever mention how Adam is essentially a brain-dead infant still suckling at his mother's teeth at the age of 33. You mentioned how you were upset that you didn't get to see the development Mantis had off-screen to get her to this point, but you never mentioned how she steals Drax's autonomy throughout the film despite promising to never do that to her friends. You talk about how Harley Quinn is shoved into skin-tight leather or fluffy dresses, but never mention how Peacemaker is routinely shown in his tidy whities. You said the Suicide Squad showed remarkable improvement in Ratcatcher's character writing, but never explain how or why. Was her story her own or her father's, since she uses his relationship with rats as the inspiration for her own adventures? Do you even know what makes a good female character?
The women in Creature Commandos aren't faring much better. I will refrain from speaking on Nina and the Bride as the finale has yet to air, and it's set to focus on Nina's backstory and presumably wrap up the story between Bride and Frankenstein.
Why? You had enough gall to comment on Gamora in the first Guardians of the Galaxy film despite her being in multiple different movies. There were 6 episodes of a 7-episode TV show available to dissect and analyze. Surely some sort of comment could have been made about 2 of the show's female leads, right?
However, that still leaves Cersei and the princess. The princess is over-sexualized, and her only personality trait has been horny. The animation makes a point to sexualize her, and she currently doesn't have much of a personality beyond that.
The princess is a young, healthy, and beautiful woman who has to actively suppress her desires for the sake of her kingdom. She isn't allowed to explore outside the castle walls without an armed guard. She's pent up in a castle, waiting for an army of male chuds to come and kill her. One night, she is visited by a handsome, healthy, older gentleman who promises to protect her against an all-powerful witch from an island of mystical power woman. She doesn't know she will even be alive the next day. And as one has seen in many a TV show and film before this one, passion takes a hold of her as she leaps into the embrace of Rick Flag Sr., or at least attempts to, as we see Rick deny her advances multiple times, only giving in after suffering multiple bodily wounds in a fight with Phosphorus. You say she doesn't have much of a personality beyond being horny, while ignoring the predicament that she is in. We see her try to accommodate every member of the Commandos, so we know she is kind. She tries to learn more about the outside world through Rick, so we know she is inquisitive. This is supported by her situation, which has her isolated from the rest of the world. Try and put yourself in her shoes and see how much of a personality you end up having as a result.
Cersei is explicitly slut-shamed in the show, and I will argue the final establishment and how Gunn chooses to adapt women specifically.
And now you take issue with a character lambasting another for being too horny-coded. So which is it? Is a character over-sexualized for showing an interest in performing a basic bodily function? Or is it slut-shaming for pointing out that they dress like a power broad? You took issue with Harley Quinn's outfits in the Suicide Squad for being too problematic, despite her being fully clothed both times, showing less skin in those outfits than in the previous 2 films. But now, it's shameful to have Amanda Waller, a secondary antagonist and a woman, rag on the primary antagonist for showing too much skin. Pick a struggle, why don't you?
Where characters like Quill, Rocket, Weasel, etc. are shown to be more powerful, women like Cersei, Gamora, Aisha, Phyla-Vell, Mantis, etc. are stripped of power and competency to suit the plot.
Weasel dies at the start of the Suicide Squad and isn't seen again till the end of the movie. In Creature Commandos, he is subdued by 2 police officers as he attempts to save a little girl's life, and then spends the rest of his life in prison. The only person who seems to care about him is his lawyer, who tries to give him his fair day in court. Rocket dies at the start of Guardians of the Galaxy 3. He serves as much of a function as a corpse does for more than half the film's runtime in order to suit the plot. Peter dies in basically every film he is in, or comes so close to it that he may as well be considered dead if it wasn't for the help of the Guardians. Peter strips himself of power and leaves the Guardians at the end of this film, making Rocket the new captain. In Guardians of the Galaxy 1, Peter is stripped of all of his possessions and has to rely on Rocket and Gamora to help him escape, since Gamora gets the access card and Rocket forms the plan. Peter relies on Gamora's deal with the Collector to make his money. Peter surrenders himself to the Power Stone to prevent Ronan from getting it, and needs the help of each individual Guardian to overcome its grip. Gamora encourages Peter to stay on Ego's planet, learning more about his heritage and his dormant power. The Guardians rely on Mantis's power to subdue Ego long enough to plant Rocket's bomb. Peter loses all sense of power against Ego until Yondu teaches him to rely on his heart instead of his head. This allows Peter to remember all of the important people in his life, which includes Gamora, Rocket, Drax, and his mother, the single most important person to Peter, the inciting incident for the entire franchise, the reason he shot Ego in the face, the reason he reaches out to Gamora's hand in the first film. Peter's mom and her impact on his character is arguably the single most powerful force in these films. She almost prevented Ego from committing genocide simply because she was a joy to be around. The women of this franchise are incredibly important people, even if they don't meet your typical surface level understanding of what it means to be powerful.
This isn't experienced by male character, it is exclusively limited to women, which is what we're talking about when we say that Gunn is bad at writing women.
When it comes to properties like the Suicide Squad and Creature Commandos, are you just going to ignore Amanda Waller, the head of Task Force X, the person who has sole access to a device which will either kill or electrocute each individual member of the team if they step out of line? You say Cersei has her power removed, but don't care to mention that she is a primary antagonist for the first few episodes of the show. She had magic projectiles, the power of flight, and super strength, but she also has matter manipulation as seen with her fight against the Bride. If this is my opponent, why would I not do everything in my power to make sure she was as powerless as possible? Or are you still annoyed because Amanda called her a slag? You didn't even mention the fact she controlled an entire regiment of men the Amazonians abandoned because they weren't women. The Sons of Themyscira, known in the comics for being taken in by Hephaestus, who traded weapons from his forge with the Amazonians so that their lives may be spared. Else they would have been drowned at sea for the failure of being born the wrong gender. And what did James Gunn do with them in this show? Well, he turned them into Reddit atheists. I didn't bother talking about Aisha or Phila Vale since they are basically literal Who characters. If you made any sort of argument about why they suck, I'd probably agree with you. I already gave a handful of examples of times where male characters have their power taken from them to suit the plot, but I may as well toss in Drax getting destroyed by Ronan in their confrontation just for good measure. You never see a female character losing this badly in a one-on-one fight. Well, I guess that's not true anymore. It did take 10 years for that to happen to a female character, but at least it happened.
He'll break character writing, he'll ignore what he's established to degrade or devalue a woman, and never will he do that to a man.
He literally ignored the suffering of an entire faction of men who should be amongst the most sympathetic characters in his story's setting, just so he could make a joke at the expense of certain YouTube individuals. One of the most important scenes of Guardians of the Galaxy 2 is when Yondu confronts Rocket about the reason why he is such a prick all the time, and in an attempt to get Rocket to level with him, degrades him, makes him feel low. This is all done as a means of connecting with him on a personal level, as they share many of their qualities with each other. But Yondu doesn't want Rocket to end up the same way he did, and this confrontation sticks with Rocket till the very end of the film.
Do I think it's a conscious choice? No, not really, but it is a consistent one that has been seen for literally over a decade. The one moment of improvement was followed by a complete regression. It is a pattern of his work. It always has been.
That's funny, because I haven't seen a goddamn thing he's done wrong with these characters till we got to Guardians of the Galaxy 3.
That doesn't mean his entire catalogue of work is terrible, it means that he has a blind spot when it comes to women.
So here's the clarification. Would have been nice to see this earlier, but I guess better late than never. And I don't think this is a fair assessment either. Gunn does show a blind spot in Volume 3, but it's not just the woman. Peter is reduced to nothing more than a drunken buffoon lovesick over his dead ex, who tries to hit on Nebula when he is reminded that he is his ex's adopted sister. Drax is flanderized so much that he barely becomes recognizable to the character we have known since 2014. Groot isn't a character at all. He barely has any impact on the story. Adam Warlock shares a remarkably interesting fate as the single dumbest character in this franchise, and the reason for why there's such a blind spot, it's because Rocket was his favorite character and received the bulk of his attention. Granted, Endgame did a remarkable amount of damage to his characters already, but this movie didn't help.
Also, as a side addition, Creature Commandos does engage in anti-Roma racism, specifically in its depiction of a Roma woman in Episode 4. I have not included that in the thread as I'd like to gather my thoughts more, but it does deserve to be mentioned. You just fucking did, what do you mean? Oh my god, redraft your fucking script.
Well, just like with the Mantis remarks, I'd prefer to see what arguments are made before I discuss them further. I'm not the biggest fan of this thread, which is what led me to making this video in the first place, but I don't think this was done out of malice or a desire to attack Gunn. I think this just comes down to a good old-fashioned case of media illiteracy, as much as I loathe to use the word. But it does apply. A failure to engage with the media in question beyond a surface level that adheres to their principles. But that's not to say they were without merit. Maeve's comments on Guardians of the Galaxy 3 were spot on as far as I'm concerned, and they provided excellent examples and comparisons that strengthened their points. While I do think their arguments for the rest of the work were pretty weak, they still showed the desire to want to engage with the material. So even if they were wrong, I can't fault them for trying. My only recommendation would be to try and view these films and shows again, but leaving this lens behind. It seems detrimental to the overall experience and would make the few good points you do have seem weaker by comparison, as others would tend to ignore them. I hope you all enjoyed and had a lovely Christmas and New Year's. You will hopefully see me again soon with a review of Creature Commandos, as I definitely have some thoughts there. Till then, take care and see you next time.